for almost 20 years, I've been using the pronunciation Yahweh, and really knowing in myself that this was the true pronunciation of the Father's name, of the Tetragrammaton, and there was very deep, attachment to it. And so,
well, I really appreciate your intellectual honesty that you went into it. On the one hand, you said, I want to prove Nehemia wrong, but you also, said, okay, let's look at the evidence, and I really appreciate that. And my name, properly, people call me Nehemia. That's actually an Eastern European pronunciation of my name. The proper Hebrew, undisputable, my name is Nehemiah. And I only had one professor who ever called me Nehemiah. He was, a stickler for biblical Hebrew. And why is it Yah and not Nehemiah? Because Yah is the emphasized syllable. It has to be Yah. But then you take that Yah and you put it at the beginning of the name, and at the beginning of my name, it would be Yehonachem. And Yehonachem, it couldn't be, I can't say it couldn't be. It wouldn't normally be Yahunachem. That's just not how Hebrew works. That would be very awkward. Because the emphasized syllable is so far from the syllable, from that Yud, which is the Yud of Yud He Vav He, the Yahu becomes Yeho. And that kind of is very intuitive and makes perfect sense to somebody who has studied proper biblical Hebrew. If you're just a Hebrew speaker, you might not know what the rules are. But as you learn the rules of grammar and how the language is structured, that's just obvious. Okay, so there I am, and I put aside my work, which is to, and I have to admit, I wasn't a very good worker. I was being paid to do this job. And I put it aside, and I say, my job is to check every jot and tittle. It'll take me an hour to read one page. I don't have an hour. I need to know now. Is this a mistake or not? I'm burning inside to know. And I put it aside, and I say, I'm just going to skim the pages looking for the name. And I got to tell you, back then I had much better vision than I do now. So I start skimming, and I go page after page, and I keep finding Yud He Vav He with the missing vowel. And it's like torturing me, like, so it was just that one place. I'm like Gideon, I need a second witness. So I start, going page after page after page. About 15 minutes later, I find a second instance where Yud He Vav He has the full vowels. And I look at that and I say, okay, second witness. This isn't a fluke. At the time, I knew of two manuscripts. That was my second witness in the second manuscript. The first one, I'm sure, was just one quirky scribe, right? But now it's two scribes, two manuscripts, and the most important manuscript in the world. It's in the Israel Museum alongside the Shrine of the Book. That's how important the Aleppo Codex is considered. And I said, okay, this is not a fluke. This really is his name. And but I'm going up against a scholarly bulwark of consensus. And the scholarly bulwark of consensus is this Yahweh. Every university professor, every seminary student knows it's Yahweh. Why? Because it says it in Gesenius's grammar. And without Gesenius's grammar, we're lost, right? That's the definitive grammar of biblical Hebrew, written by a German Christian in the 1800s. Later, I come to find out he gives two sources. I didn't know this at the time. And I get people, I call them the word police. They'll come to me and say, you shouldn't say Wednesday because Wednesday is the day of Odin. And that actually happens to be true. That Woden's day is the Norse god. But I say, okay, what do you want me to do? I could talk to you in Hebrew, and then I'll say Yom Revi'i, fourth day. But if we're talking English, it's called Wednesday. If you want to get the whole English world to agree and changing it to fourth day, I got no problem with that. But until then, the whole purpose of language is that we're able to communicate. So if I have some term that nobody else knows, what it means, well, what good is that? And what I'm referring to is that Gesenius gives two main reasons in his early work about where later he backtracks from this, but in his early work, you can see it's almost like, like later he's like, okay, we've got to polish this and get rid of our, we don't want to show our work like in mathematics, right? We're just going to show the result. But you can see his work in the earlier version of his, he actually wrote a lexicon, which became the basis for Brown Driver Briggs, which is the standard, up until recently, certainly was the standard lexicon of biblical Hebrew. What they often don't tell you have to read the introduction, is Brown. So what happened is Driver expanded on what Brown did, and Briggs expanded what Driver did, so it's called Brown Driver Briggs. But Brown expanded on what Gesenius did in his German lexicon. So it should actually be called Gesenius Brown Driver Briggs, but they don't call it that. So in his early lexicon, he explains two reasons for saying Yahweh. if you have to look really far back to find out what his real reason is, the real reason is that Yahweh in Hebrew, they hypothesized, the people who advocated that pronunciation, we're talking like the early 1800s. They said, well, that in Hebrew should mean he that causes to be. And what is the name of the creator God? It should be creator, right? And we have Yud He Vav He. We don't know what the vowels are because all we have are the vowels of Adonai, or so it's claimed. And by the way, Adonai is an ah, and in the manuscripts, there's not an ah, there's an eh in that place. So Yehovah is the vowels when it has the full vowels, which again is very rare. Normally there's a missing vowel, but even when there's a missing vowel, there's no ah there. There's an eh. So it should be obvious. Those aren't the vowels of Adonai. It should have been obvious to me too, but it wasn't. I'm being told by these people who are supposed to be much smarter than me that those are the vowels of Adonai. Anyway, so back to Gesenius, this German Christian in the early 1800s. So he says that one of the sources we have for the pronunciation, and of course the background of all this is we know it means he that causes to be. In Hebrew, that's Yahweh. And I should point out that that's a hypothetical form of the Hebrew verb to be that's never been found in biblical Hebrew, at least. So it's a fictitious form that these German scholars invented, these Christian European scholars. They invented what they wanted the name to be. They created that grammatical form to fit it. So in any event, so going back to his two main arguments in his lexicon, one is that, well, there's a Christian named Theodoret of Cyrus who says the Jews pronounce the Tetragrammaton Aya, and the Samaritans pronounce it Yahweh. Okay, well, Yahweh is nothing in Hebrew. That can't be the name. So if we back translate Yahweh into Hebrew, then it could be Yahweh. It's possible because Greek doesn't have a hey. There's no H sound in Greek, right? So Yahweh could be transcribed as a Greek by as Yahweh. And by the way, that shows in this period, if that's true, that the Vav was pronounced as a V. Now there's a W. That's a different discussion. But that's a Samaritan pronunciation. And later I found out that the Samaritans didn't even pronounce the name. So, and there's evidence for that for example, from Josephus, that the Samaritans, going back to 330 or so BCE, they refer to their God as the God who is anonymous, who has no name. That's at least one that's spoken. So this is a Christian quoting a Samaritan who didn't even speak the name, and we're talking like in the 400s AD. Well, wait a minute. Even if it is a Samaritan who spoke the name, the Samaritans are Gentiles who were brought from Babylon, who then learned about the God of Israel from a wicked priest from the high places. Why would I listen to them? And the Jews, they're telling us pronounce it differently. Aya. Well, what's Aya? Aya can be one of two things. Eheyeh, which is Exodus 3:14, I will be. But more likely it's just Yah, as in hallelujah. And remember that Yah and hallelujah, that the emphasis is on the Yah. If you take those same two letters, Yud He, and then add the Vav and put it at the beginning, it should be a Shva. Yeho. That's the pre-tonal shortening concept.
Right.
Anyway, so one of these sources he brings is a Christian quoting a Samaritan. The Christian's writing in Greek. I hope this isn't too technical. And the other one he brings blew me away when I saw it. I said, this can't be true. He can't be saying this. And what Gesenius says sometime in the 1830s, I believe it is he says that, and I have a whole study on my website. I'm not doing this justice. It's called something like, Are You Praying to Jupiter? And it's on nehemiaswall.com, nehemiaswall.com. And it turns out, he says, well, the ancient Greeks had a god named Jupiter. And that god Jupiter wasn't called Jupiter. He was called Yahweh, because in ancient Latin, Jupiter is actually Yahweh Pater, which is Father Yahweh. What? And so Yahweh, he says, must come from the same source as the God of the Hebrews, and therefore, based on what we know from Latin, because in Latin we know the vowels, in Hebrew we don't, argues Gesenius. Since in Latin it's Yahweh, in Hebrew it must be Yahweh. And he argues that the Latins got the name of their God from some ancient Egyptian source, and the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt got the name of their God from the same place. And so therefore, of course, Yahweh wouldn't be a Hebrew form, so it would be Yahweh. And oh boy. And I realized then and there, okay, so this conspiracy theory, I mean, that's a smoking gun. It's not a conspiracy theory. He's telling us. that Yahweh, he's the man, the main source, the main academic source for arguing that the name is Yahweh is saying that, well, Jupiter, that proves it, because it's Yahweh Pater, Father Yahweh. I mean, whoa. I think, you know, there's this academic consensus, but when you peel away the layers of the onion, you peel off the mask of the what's that cliche from the movie, of the of the Matrix. No, the Matrix. Okay. You're peeling off this mask of the Matrix, where you realize, oh, all these scholars, they all agree it's Yahweh. It says it in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, here's where they got it from. They got it from the guy who says, well, the Hebrews had the same God as the ancient Latins, and they worship Yahweh Pater. And I had to call up several different scholars who are experts in Latin, because I'm not an expert in Latin. And I said, is this true? And they're like, well, yeah. And I said, well, no, but surely in ancient Latin, it's written as a V. It was Yahweh. They're like, no, in ancient Latin, it was a W. And I'm like, wow. It was a W that became a V in later Latin. In early Latin, it was a W. And so it actually is Yahweh. And there's no question that in ancient Latin, Yahweh and Yahweh are virtually, I mean, obviously it's a slightly different pronunciation, but it's virtually indistinguishable. And they look at the letters Yud He Vav He, and they, to the best of their knowledge, believe those are Yahweh. Okay, I'm not going to judge you, but at least know where it comes from the consensus of wonderful scholars who argue that it's Yahweh. At least know where they're getting it from. So when you say Yahweh, I mean, that's completely the Latin pronunciation.
Right.
Because Latin tends to have the syllable on the anyway, I'm not a Latin expert. Let's move on. All right. So, but yeah, it's definitely not a Hebraic sound when you say Yahweh. It's my way or it's Yahweh. I mean, that just doesn't sound Hebrew. You know, what's interesting is you could go to Israel and say to any rabbi Yahweh, he will have no idea what you're talking about. If you say Jehovah, he will yell at you and tell you, don't say that name. It's too holy. Get out of here. He might not say get out of here, but he'll immediately recognize that that's the name. And it's funny. I put out, it's not even funny. I put out this book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. And I've discussed this with rabbis who unfortunately won't go on the record, which, you know, you'd expect. And they'll say, so you put out a book proving the sky is blue, that the name is, and they won't say it, but they'll, meaning I'll tell them the name is Jehovah. They'll be like, no, duh, Sherlock. Of course it's, of course that's it. And sometimes they'll say Yeho, and then they'll pause, Va. Like I've had one rabbi do that. Because they can't say the name. It's forbidden by tradition. But obviously that's it. And I have never to this day met a rabbi who said the name is Yahweh. Maybe there are some. I'm sure there might be some at Bar Ilan University, which is, an academic institution based on Gesenius, who will say, well, and you ask them, what's the source? Do you have Jewish sources that it's Yahweh? Well, no, Gesenius says that, and he has good arguments. Okay, whatever. Right. There's no I've never found a Jewish source, an ancient Jewish source, a medieval Jewish source that said it's Yahweh. I have found Jewish sources that say it's Jehovah. In fact, I'm working on a study right now where I've uncovered 16 rabbis who say it's Jehovah, which is pretty cool. In writing, meaning like if you go to a rabbi today and say, I want to get you in a recording saying it's Jehovah, they probably won't do it. But these were rabbis who were writing to each other. And there's one letter I found where the rabbi is writing to the other rabbi, and he says, hide this in a pure and holy place. And he explains that things like this shouldn't be made public. They shouldn't even be printed. They should only be written in writing, lest the unworthy, meaning us, use them and find out that his name is Jehovah.